I thought everybody talks about this. The world experienced significant turmoil between 2020 and 24. And I think when I take 2025, the turmoils have been even very, very, multiplied. Given what's happening yesterday in India in terms of the halting of aircraft and the cancelling of this as a small example, and trade across the globe. And if you see the way the world order has been put aside, the way WTO has been totally sidelined, and how the world has become very central to the sovereign interest and national interest, is becoming very interesting that the global trade wars are defining the way the world will organize itself in a multilateral trade or bilateral as a part of the multilateral trade, but everything would be different. And for supply chain folks, the trade lanes would change. If you see the consumer needs across globe is changing, and I think the panel did a good job of putting that particular thing in place. And you look at the commitment for sustainability, and I think that's one of the macroeconomic factors or long-term geopolitical factors that are going to define your strategic competitive advantages, and hence it becomes a very important part of planning. So it's increasingly clear that the resulting shift in how people live, work, and play are not temporary but structural, beginning a new economic era characterized by volatility, regionalized supply chains, AI dominance, and talent scarcity. How do you build a supply chain in such a turmoil world? And it's very clear that the focus of this particular Senate has been on Make in India. Let's look at few figures in the global world. This is IMF October Outlook. You find that the world economy is caught up in a sticky growth rate of 3.2, 3.1%. I think the global scenarios are very different. If you look at United States, it will decline this year and then it will slightly grow. If you look at Euro areas, it's again very stagnant. Only it's the Middle East and the Central Asia which showed some growth. And if you look at emerging and developing Asias, that also, which is the central focal point of growth in last 50 years, we have been talking about, that's been degrowing. You look at Sub-Saharan Africa, it's slight hope of growth in 2026. Latin America is also flat, and hence the world growth is flat. In a flat world, what would be the best strategy for Indian companies to really operate? And this is a fundamental question, because if you really see India, you find that India has been also degrowing in some instance. There's some figure of 8.2%, but let's look at 2025, and 2026 is 6.6 or 6.7% by the IMF October this thing. A economy which is fastest growing economy in the world. If you take other smaller economies, is one of the fastest growing economies in the world, despite a lot of constraints and geopolitical turmoils and even macroeconomic challenges. Though India's macroeconomy as compared to the rest of the world shows a very robust macroeconomy, and hence there are possibility of growth. But what is also interesting to see is that, and this is where an earlier report of IMF captured this. Asia will contribute about 70% of the global growth this year, and despite the degrowth of China, China will contribute around 35%, and India will contribute about 50.4%. That means India's contribution to the global growth, not global GDP, just the growth, is increasing by leaps and bounds from 3% few years back to a very significant percentage point, 15.4% of the growth in the global. And this is where India's story starts, and this is where India is on the move. And this is where a lot of interest that has emerged in India, and this is where this government has really conceptualized well as to Make in India. There would always be a pros and cons of that. There will always be an assessment which is positive and negative. But I think looking at this, we are clearly seeing that there are enough opportunities for India and how companies can look at it. In fact, India is transitioning from a demand-rich market to global supply chain powerhouse, manufacturing, logistics, and digital economy to drive next 5 to 10 trillion growth phase. And supply chain must be resilient, tech-intensive, sustainable, and future-ready. I think all of us talk about this. Every time this is one oft-repeated lemon, the supply chain must be resilient, tech-intensive, sustainable, and future-ready. And Bharat at 100 demands a new operating model built on speed, scale, trust, and transparency. This is for existing large manufacturing companies too, or services companies too. It is not just for the MSME to be ready. MSMEs have to be incorporated in the overall ecosystem of making the large businesses do better. And I think there has to be a larger holistic integration of MSME. Global rebalancing, friendshoring, China plus one, and regionalization of supply chain networks, India digital public infrastructure enabling mass formalization and frictional commerce, and omni-channel consumption, which is becoming a great reality, and I think we saw people talking about it, and tech explosion and MSME integrating into large value chains. I think we are into something which needs to be done in a big way. And India needs to plan its supply chain in a very simple sense. Two elements, I think given the constraint of time, I will just take up planning and stress testing as a focal point for India's supply chains. And we saw planning being discussed in a more detailed way by the panelists. How do we localize? It's often said that friendshoring, localization is important. But do we have a framework for doing this? Should we just localize for the sake of localizing it? And this is important as an element because when you look at stress test, I think this is an MIT framework which is very popular across the globe among academicians, and it's also a way to stress testing the whole supply. If you are in automotive with 30,000 sub-suppliers, how do you really look at whether you need to create a resilience program or create a geographical movement of a supply base? And this is very critical. Even during all disruptions, one can really look at is that this framework can help. The two concepts that are important, time to recover and time to survive. And if you look at time to recover, it would take for a particular node in the supply chain, a supplier facility, a distribution center, or a transportation hub, to be restored to full functionality after a disruption. Time to survive, the maximum duration that the supply chain can match supply chain demand after a facility disruption. And if the time to recover for a given facility is greater than the time to survive, the supply chain will not be able to match supply with demand unless a backup plan exists. And this is the time where one really needs to look whether while planning a geographical movement, can we look at localizing only those where time to recover is more than the time to survive. And those are the components or the supplies that are needed locally, rather than everything, because not everything can be built within a country. The world will still remain global. China will still remain a very, very important thing. So how do you look at resilience? And then the question of resilience comes at how do I really know my supply base? And if I really look at the global supply base, it's very clearly, MIT report is saying that you don't have visibility beyond tier 1. And if you don't have visibility beyond tier 1 anywhere in the world, then you cannot plan, whatever be the growth rate, whatever be your demand planning, as everybody was saying, you cannot actually plan for your supply chains because you don't have the visibility. What happens if there is a disruption in a tier 24 supplier in an automotive industry? You don't know where the alternatives are. You don't know what are the alternatives? You don't know whether what disruptions are taken where. So it's again a black box. And hence, it is very important for us to invest into resilience. And what does resilience mean? Resilience means just two things. Have I built enough agility into my supply system by creating huge amount of visibility into the system? Can modern IT solution providers can also provide visibility into the geographies? Do I know the characteristics of geographies, and do I know the geographies of my suppliers? And do I know the alternate geographies of my suppliers? And do I know the cost of shifting from one supply base to another supply base? And how fast can I move? Do I have enough partnerships, enough data to really do this? And I think the resilience in the global world, and I think some of the failures in the Make in India programs are primarily because of this, that we become too enthusiastic about shifting everything to India rather than not realize that few things can be shifted in a world which has already been evolved. Few needs to be made more resilient, and then obviously few needs to be sourced from different countries like China +1, China +2, China +5, whatever strategy that you have. But ruling out China as a major source of sourcing can be a very, very dangerous strategic move. What we need to do is that we need to really see the competitive strength of competitive advantage of India as a nation state and do something of this kind of stress testing, a very simple framework, and then define everything. This framework can also be used in a supply chain design where you see the supply facilities, a distribution center, a transportation hub. Every disturbances can be actually looked into it. And you can actually get a huge amount of understanding about disruptions in the supply chain. They can create huge amount of bullwhip effect, which have, in fact, if you see a normal standard textbook definition of bullwhip effect, this is all about whipping up the supply chain, or it's a promotions. Here is the major source of any bullwhip, and it can create a kind of a supply chain continuity program which can never continue. It can totally be disrupted, and this is where the problem lies. And I think this is where the very first fundamental that Making India program needs to do is to put this as a basic structure of supplies and see that the supplies becomes very, very efficient, and we know where to supply. And I think, sadly enough, we have seen so many good investments into visibility into the suppliers domain, but they have not sustained themselves because companies have not moved beyond Tier 1, their planning has not moved beyond Tier 1 and Tier 2. And I think this is where, even if there's an intent, there is a technology, your outcomes may not be optimal. And this could be a major source of this thing. So this is one element that I see. If you look at the kind of disruptions in your supplies that you see, I think this is a very good point made by Pratibha and others also in the last this thing. If on the one hand we look at the macroeconomy of the geography that you are really catering to, and you are defining the demand patterns for a few years, maybe your planning horizon is 5 to 7 years. The real challenge is that a country like India may grow at 7% or 10%, and its infrastructure needs may grow in a very different way. Infrastructure needs today, which are totally fulfilled by the government, may go private. As economy grows, aspiration grows, private. Are we really planning for that kind of investments that take place? Are we really putting our facilities in place and our networks and partnership in place that as we grow, we are able to meet all the demand? I think we have seen this. While the demand for infrastructure has grown, demand for rails have grown, demand for transportation have grown, demand for other infrastructural assets have grown, the supplies have remained constant, even including aerospace and defense, which has become a very important part of the Make India program. How do we plan for this? How do we plan for those disruptions? And this is where I think if the product is fairly, functional, and if demand will grow, I can have a very clear enough future. But how do you build scenarios where product has a different, outcomes in the long term? What are the data that I need, and what kind of capabilities that we need, long-term capabilities that we need? I think planning becomes largely, and we're talking about short-term supply chain planning. We forget that integrating the long-term planning process is a very important element of the growth strategy and competitive advantage of any nation state. And I think that has to be there. And the strategic planning that takes place in the organization, and few organizations like I've seen Castrol, BP, they have been doing an amazing, because they have been affected by the pricing patterns of global oil, and hence they have been planning in a way that they can understand how do you move from one continuity strategy to another strategy. And I think the volatility today forces us to learn from better scenario planning that Cell and other companies have done, and how do we adopt to our own industry? How do we adopt to our own industry? It's a big challenge that can be. There is a need for scenario planning. In fact, some of the planners do a sensitivity analysis in the short run and call it as scenarios. Some of even the solution provider calls sensitivity analysis to be scenario planning. Scenario planning, especially for the project businesses and that, commodity businesses where the vulnerabilities on the supplies can be very high, is very, very important. And I think we pay a very narrow interest to doing all these things, and this becomes very critical. If India has to grow in the areas of manufacturing, there's nothing but these plants have to be there. And this plan has to really provide you the maturity to see India in 2047 or India in 2090. I think we don't have a plan for that particular, even though Modi claims to be creating a Viksit Bharat in 2070. So I think scenario planning becomes a very, very critical areas of interest. I thought I'll end here because the presentation is too long and we started late. But one comment on planning and forecasting. I did make, you don't forecast with single numbers today. I think Dibya said this. If the forecast is 1,000 and we have planned for 100, plan for 100 to 1,000, plan for the range. Why? Why it's important to plan for the range? Maybe for such businesses which are project-based, they also have their own, long tails. You see the kind of long tails that you are creating, primarily because there's too much of text there. You've seen number of SKUs that proliferating either in your component business or in the consumer business. How do you forecast something which is not the normal functional time series models, where all of us are or Excel sheets do that. We don't know how to find the range. How do you find the range with probability of their occurrences? I think some element of base demand planning, which act as a demand base, requires some amount of intelligence and some amount of this thing. Why can't I plan for not 100, but 50 to 250, which is the range which occurs over the long tail, and not most of them are, complete median or mean. They are scattered with huge amount of standard deviations with lumpy, intermittent and zero demand. How do we do this? So I think element of understanding how the demand is changing in this particular country is important, because if you see the whole thing, all these have been talked about, so I'm just moving ahead, but let me come back to all these have been talked about in this thing. So in a country which shows a lot of promise, if you look at the geographical segmentation of Indian retail, Tier 1 cities are $205 billion, Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities have grown significantly to $195 billion, and rural is $530 billion. Where are we actually? All reports says this, but I think Abhishek was talking about modern retail has actually brought about a huge transfer. Abhishek, here is the challenge. We still operate with super stockist model, largely in this domain. We are ignorant about the whole geography of rural India and even Tier 1 and Tier 2 cities partially. And this is very important because if you really see, many companies in the country has adopted direct distribution models, and those distribution models have become their sourcing models. I'm not going to get into the details of it. But how do you define the new models to reach the last miles of India is very important. And last mile of India is very critical in terms of long tails. Whether it is your automotive components, whether it is your FMCG, whether it is your pharma, whether anything that you have to sell there has a huge geography. How do you create a distribution framework for them? And I think Indian companies and multinationals have remained 50 years behind because they are still looking at everything, and they're still looking at super stockists as the only way to go. Modern retail has its own limitation in these markets. Not much has been done, though I would say that some companies have really reached the hubs that they have created a hub and spoke model. I think rural India, Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities needs three things. A new way of using AI, ML and technology to understand the change, a new investment into infrastructure and logistics infrastructure, including cold chain and roads and others to reach the last mile. And three, they already have, which has been created by the government, Jan Aadhaar and mobile. They have an amazing infrastructure. You go to a furthest village in India and you can scan this thing. Corporates are behind the government. I think this as an academician, I would say this because unless you match that kind of a deep penetration into the last miles, the Make in India program will not make its sense. Make in India program is also for Make for India. And Make for India provides an amazing opportunities in the coming future. The only difference between India and China is that China is now trying to get into domestic consumption. It's investing heavily. It has been heating its economy and it's cooling its economy by investments into infrastructure and largely trying to create demand in the rural markets. India, despite all the constraint, has looked inside and it has survived, but it needs to consolidate. And everything that we do needs to be a part of this. So I thought I'll just bring a larger conceptual framework for Make in India program rather than get into every aspect of it in terms of numbers. And India supply chain makes, and supply chain is all that you do. It's competitive advantage. It's nothing to do with operational strategy alone. It has to be a part of your business strategy. You have to have a value stream, you have to have a logistics stream, and you have to make money. So you have to have a revenue stream. If you don't build that model around that, it may be very difficult for us to survive. Thank you very much.